And welcome. This is our series on World War One. This is episode 2, the first month of the war. We did miss last week. Sorry, Mother's Day and all that. Stuff happens. Stick around later tonight. We will be covering Game of Thrones, so you don't want to miss that. Anyway, I'm joined here by MC and Farty, our resident drunken Aussie. And 40 ounce may or may not be joining us. We'll see. Guys, set up the story here. What are we talking about?
Okay, so we've basically done the whole fucking bloody shooting Archduke Ferdinand, all this kind of stuff. We've waited the 30 odd days for everybody to get their shit together, and now things are starting to kick off. Around about August 7th, the Germans, as they were moving through the Alsace-Lorraine region, they were met upon by the French, and they were having numerous skirmishes along the way up until this point. This is when the French started to actually create a counter-offensive against the Germans. And this is where you had your first major battles with your first large losses of life. In this instance alone, you had about 260,000 casualties in the first month. About 75,000 were killed. So basically they'd figured that this Schifflin plan was moving as a gigantic sweep, and they're now moving their forces up to try and halt them. And this brings in another bullshit, old school, outdated bloody tactic that shouldn't really have been put in the plan in the first place, with hindsight and whatnot. Because of the whole, this is the first big European war with mass machine guns and artillery and all this kind of stuff. This is the first time they're actually only learning this. The French initially had a plan of always on the attack. Basically, they felt that courage and bravery were going to win the day. And when you put this up against machine guns, it didn't work out very well.
Yeah, and they are attacking more in the southern region here. All right, that's what their plan is. Their plan is the French know about the von Schieffelin plan, and their attitude was the threat of the von Schieffelin plan. Its weakness is as they begin this big wheel, if you can then cut them off from the supplies by coming through these areas here, right, into Germany, you could basically trap the German army, all right, stuck and leave it stuck here, in Belgium, right, where then you surround it and then you could destroy it. There's two problems with this plan, with that idea, all right, and it's exactly like 40 says. The Germans are like, okay, in this portion of the pivot, it's got to be in a defensive mode, so they've dug in defenses, and so these waves of French attacking, all right, is not going anywhere. All right, they're just meeting up stiff defense. All right, and for the most part, they're just getting butchered.
And while this is also happening too, is every time there is a French assault, the Germans have already got their little defensive positions and whatnot. They just mow them all down, and then while the French are trying to regroup, the Germans are advancing and then setting up new defensive positions.
Yes, and so
this is down south in the Belfort, by River LaSalle.
It's in this area right here is where you're seeing this happen.
Oh, Luxembourg, Metz, and
okay. Now up here it's Liege, and up here Namur, and these were supposed to be fortified towns. All right, they were supposed to be able to withstand the Germans. What the Germans do is they bring up, all right, heavy rail guns made by Krupp, and you can find pictures of these things, and they just totally obliterate these fortifications. It does slow them down, but not outside of their table. Okay, and so you see the Germans beginning their advance. Okay, the German advance is far more rapid than what anybody had expected on the Allied side. All right, and then you run into right here at Mons. All right, now Mons is, in order to try and get into France, you've got to go past these friggin' rivers and all these friggin' canals. Mons is one of the places where there's a lot of canals, and they convince the British, French. The French can convince the British, right? They get them to say, look, can you hold Mons in a delaying action for 24 hours to give us a chance to start extending these lines? And so a battle begins from the British perspective on the defense.
Yep. Yeah, pretty much. And the rear guard action, that was where was the number for that? 55,000 British troops in the BEF against 140,000 Germans in that area.
Well, no, and as the German army started to bog down, or not bog down, but hunker down and prepare for the French onslaught, the French actually started to lose ground on the other fronts, right?
Yep.
Well, they're being forced back in these other areas. This is showing basically the von Schlieffen plan. All right, and as the battle develops for the Battle of the Mons, right here. Okay, you can see these are entire armies, and the British. Now, when we're talking about an army, you're talking, from the perspective of the Germans, you're talking, 200,000 men approximately. Now, the armies, these are armies in World War I. Armies are basically infantry. You don't have, you have cavalry, but it's real cavalry. It's people on horses. Okay. How effective is that against a set of machine gun? They're not very effective. Okay. So the cavalry isn't working well from that perspective. All right. And what the French are, because the French are getting counterattacked down in this lower area down here, they're losing contact. So the idea is okay, well, if they can hold Mons long enough, all right, then they can straighten out these lines, because the worst thing that you can get into is what's happening here. You see how you're creating a salient here? You're creating a bubble.
Yeah.
All right, you don't want to get trapped in a bubble.
Well, no, and here's a question about the cavalry. I get what you're saying, but couldn't you use them almost like a picket line in the Civil War, where you have them out on the flanks watching the enemy movement, and then you can run messages that way?
Because
Utilize
you've still got to move your men up on foot, and by the time the Germans have already outflanked one part of it, by the time you start moving your blokes up, the Germans are already attacking.
Right. Well, so what you're seeing is the French forces that initially were thinking they were going to be in the attack are now being forced back. You got to straighten out your lines. You got to maintain your lines, all right, while the Germans come across. Now, you'll notice that it's during this part of the phase, right after the Battle of the Mons, that the reinforcement that the Germans are expecting don't take place. And the reason they don't take place is because of the next battle we're going to talk about, right? But how effective that would have been is still debatable, right? So you end up back at the situation where you were before. You really do, which is okay. These lines begin to stabilize. Let me get back to that other.
Well, no, and as the French army starts to retreat, don't the British Expeditionary Forces kind of dig in? They kind of hold their ground, even though they're a smaller force.
In the Battle of Mons, they're outnumbered, and eventually they're forced back. Okay, which is why you end up seeing the retreat. That makes sense.
Yeah. However, having said that, though, the French weren't totally fucking useless at that point in time. While the British were holding Mons and fighting the retreat and all this kind of stuff, the French were establishing fairly strong defences, so that when the British did finally have a place to fall back to, that there would be a place to fall back to.
Right. Well, that's the whole point. Is they're trying to delay this. The BEF is only totally 80,000 men. All right. They're basically facing 200,000 men by themselves, and they're trying to, okay, how are we going to do this? You got to remember the British. The purpose of the British was to support the Belgian army. Okay, they were there. You got to remember their treaty. What got them involved in this whole thing is the violation of Belgian neutrality. Okay, the other aspect of it is that the British feel, okay, this is going to be the great naval engagement because they know that the Germans have been building this massive fleet. The idea is that, well, there's going to be a duke out with the two fleets, and once that's over, that'll decide the war.
Well, here's a question because I see Falcon in the chat, and I know how he's a fan of aircraft. At this point in the war, was there any aircraft in the air? And if there was, were they
Yeah.
even equipped with machine guns yet? They were mainly reconnaissance, right?
Well, no, they're being
Right.
used generally for reconnaissance. Is that that's their main role at this point? They start seeing each other and they're waving at one another as they fly around up there on both sides. Where okay, we'll wave at one another, and then of course what ends up happening is, knowing that that's the enemy, one guy brings a gun, one guy brings a pistol up there and starts firing, which begins the okay, you want to shoot at me? Well, then I'll shoot it back, and the escalation begins from there.
Well, initially, your aircraft were things like Blériot monoplanes. They were literally like canvas on a wood frame with an engine on front. Nothing more technologically advanced than the Wright Flyer. And they didn't really have much of a capability to carry much more weight than the pilot, quite honestly.
The pilot and his camera, or his buddy in a camera.
Well,
Maybe.
no. And,
Yeah.
the real big innovation was when they created the propeller with the stutter, right, to where you could actually shoot, and it was time to where you didn't shoot your own propeller.
Yeah,
your own prop.
Interrupter gear. You'd be amazed all the different things that they tried using to do this prior to the invention of the interrupter gear. Now that's a little bit further down the track in the war, but yes, they were even thinking of metal plates on the actual propeller, so if the bullet does hit the propeller, it'd be ricocheted off in a different direction. I heard a story where that ended very, very horribly for the pilot. He ended up getting a third eye out of it. There are even instances of they were saying, "Now, fuck it, just shoot through the propellers, and if the propeller gets damaged, hopefully it'll hold on till you get back."
Is there any word that the Baron was actually flying reconnaissance at this stage in the war before they started firing on each other, or did he really just start later on?
I'm pretty sure he started a little later on.
Yeah, I haven't looked at that. I've heard different things that come to mind, but I'd have to confirm it first before I actually talk about the Red Baron. But at this point in time, especially the way movement is taking place, really the lines aren't stabilizing. Okay, there's still movement in these lines. It's just a matter of bringing things up to bear. Now, the advantage that the French had initially, they squandered because they used it incorrectly. You got to remember, where do these weapons work the best in? They work the best in defense. Okay, the French have developed the best artillery piece of the war, right? The French 76. Now, this is at the beginning of the war. It is the most accurate artillery piece, but they're trying to use it in the offense initially instead of the defense. Where it would have been awesome to let the Germans come in and then slaughter them wholesale with artillery, they're trying to move them in position, attack, and then move them in position again, which only is it's effective to a point, but really you're squandering its full capabilities by doing that. All right, you're not using it to the kind of devastating potential that you can or could. But now part of that's also because the Belgians, they're not allowed. They initially weren't going to allow any other troops, any French troops or any English troops on their soil. They were expecting these fortifications, especially at the Liege, all right, to be able to hold the Germans back for at least 6 weeks to 8 weeks. All right. And it took the Germans a week to reduce the fort to nothing. Less than a week.
Yeah.
It was the Falcon said he wouldn't mind jumping on to talk a little bit about the aircraft, and you could throw him the link on Twitter. Is what he said in the chat. And be my guest if you want.
Well, seeing as I can't get to Twitter, that's going to be kind of hard for me to do. Unfortunately, Falcon.
Oh, that's
also
right.
Too,
Twitter, aren't you?
Also, too, unfortunately, Falcon. Yeah, it's kind of jumping a little far ahead to where we're at right now.
Yeah. We'll be talking more about the planes again. Trust me, we will get to that point. I know you're chomping at the bit, Falcon.
Don't worry, I can't wait to geek out about them myself.
Where we can start talking about all the different planes in their aspects.
So,
and it'll still devolve down to how much better the Sopwith Camel is than the F-35.
well, no, and okay. So as these first battles are erupting, the mood in the United States is not our problem, right?
Basically, yeah.
The instant war is declared, the United States declares neutrality throughout the whole thing and says we're not going to get involved in any of this. And as far as we're concerned, we're just going to deal with it as work as normal, right? America is okay. You guys are battling. That's fine. We're going to sell goods. We're going to sell whatever we want to whomever we want. All right. Now this becomes an issue. All right, because the question was, do we want to force, all right, or attempt to force the British blockade? Because the British declare a blockade, okay, of all the German ports. Okay, well, that's for them. You have to stop us. Well, how does that work? Well, the Germans basically are waiting for our supplies, and the British send out, some merchant marines type ships around there to say no, and some of their destroyer craft to stop the merchant ships. And this does initially cause a lot of irritation to the Americans. Initially, the British the British blockade is not welcomed by the Americans at all. And it does create some hard feelings when American ships are seized, okay, on the high seas that are on their way to Germany by the British and brought into British ports.
Well, no, and that would have been interesting if the British would have forced their hand, or the Americans, if we would have forced our hand and broke the blockade. We could have fell on the side of the Germans, right?
Well, not necessarily. I mentioned this before, that you've got more of a relationship with the French than you do with either Germany or England or anybody else in Europe, for that matter. So, if anything, you probably would have came to the aid of the French, if anything.
There is that aspect of it, and he's not wrong. There is kind of there's still the feeling of goodwill toward the French. The French are always generally looked upon generally favorably. Once Napoleon was out of the picture, Americans never had a good relationship with Napoleon. All right, although he did sell us a ton of land, the whole Louisiana Purchase. Okay, so we weren't adversarial toward the French, but there was still a lot of goodwill toward France. And France was looked upon, you got to remember, Paris for the longest time was looked upon as the cultural center of the West. And it was still, especially during this time frame, everyone was still enamored with France, Paris. Everybody wanted to go see Paris. Everybody wants to go see the Eiffel Tower, etc. Right? It is, from that perspective, it's considered the cultural center of the West.
Yeah, there always has been that goodwill towards France, especially, you kind of learn about it in school, right? Growing up because of the Revolutionary War. So it's kind of built into the American psyche in a way.
Yeah, no, exactly. The French were the ones that helped us achieve independence. No other nation helped us achieve independence but France.
So yeah, I reckon if it would have gone down like that, the British are blocking our ships to go into Germany. Well, how come that's happening? Well, the Germans are attacking the British and the French. Oh, they're attacking the French, are they? Well, fuck the Germans.
Well, and that's really what it turns into. Is the Americans are basically, that's why they're declaring neutrality. They don't particularly care for the British. You got to remember this. The United States at this point has drawn up war plans of their own, right, to attack Britain, to attack the Canadians, right? We have war plans to do that for that very purpose, just in case we go to war with England.
We should have did it.
So anyway, what ends up happening is, and for some reason I can't pull up that freaking picture again. What ends up happening is what they call a race to the sea. All right, as the wheel starts to grind, okay, there's this ever flanking maneuver as both sides try to flank one another. After the British save the salient, where the French are able to get out of that salient, right, and not get trapped by the Germans. What you end up having then is the Germans saying, okay, we need to keep going to the flanks. Both sides start racing to the flanks, and then it stabilizes along that line that basically goes through Belgium through wipers or whippers or however you want to call it. All right, and then the lines more or less stabilize. And that's where, from that point on, that's basically where the war in the West is going to be fought. Now, we're going to talk about some big freaking battles that happen, because the French look at this as saying, okay, this is where the battle is going to take place. The Germans
muck it up, though. And see, right? Sorry to cut you off, but they muck it up, the French, in general.
It's not that they muck it up. It's that the battles can't take place the way that they think they can.
Yeah. That also comes back from the old school thinking of, well, they've been only fighting small little skirmishes and shit in their colonies. They haven't fought a gigantic army with modern weapons and all this kind of stuff. It's not that they sort of fucked it up. It's kind of like, well, they had to write the book as they were going.
Right, and they really, everyone involved, whether it's the Germans, whether it's the French, whether it's the British, and even the Americans, are really underestimating, all right, what these weapon systems can do, but they're also just feeling their way into this new technology. Okay, the French 76, like I said, begins the war as the best artillery piece in the war. All right, it's innovative, it's very effective, it's accurate. Okay, as the war progresses, they will try to use these ever newer weapons, these new weapon systems, thinking that somehow we're going to break the scenario with weapons. Right, new weapons are going to fix the situation. And to be honest, it isn't new weapons that are going to fix the situation, with the exception of the tanks. All right, we'll get to we'll get the Battle of Cambrai and some of the other areas. Tanks can be a difference in the weapons. Poison gas, yes, it's a new weapons, but it's not going to change the dynamic of the battlefields. All right, what's going to change? What could have changed the dynamic of the battlefields? They haven't messed with yet. All right. Now, meanwhile, all that's happening. What you end up with in the other side is you end up with the Battle of Tannenberg. Okay, and let me pull this up. Okay, this is the Battle of Tannenberg. What happens on the Eastern Front is the Russians surprise the Germans and attack almost immediately. They attack not just Germany, or not just the Austrians. They figured that the Austro-Hungarians were where the first blows were going to fall. The Germans are surprised when the Russians mount a major offensive in the east. All right, and specifically right through the very top of this, where you see Rennkampf and Simonov, all right, starting this attack. They didn't expect this. Now, the Germans are also, while they didn't expect this, they're expecting to fight a defensive battle here. The amount of attack forces here actually pushes the Germans back dramatically. And they actually come to the point where they're going to try and take Königsberg. Okay, this is a major threat, right? But if you take a look here, notice these lakes. These lakes are a problem, all right? And why are these lakes a problem? Because they split the two Russian militaries. They split the Russian armies, and they split this offensive. Okay, and the Germans are basically able to hold the line through here to prevent them to consolidate and re-solidify their lines so that they can work together. The Germans then also the Germans realize, holy crap, we're in trouble here. And the German commanders at the time are shocked by this, and they're not acting well. And so they get replaced. And the Germans replace, I can't think of the guy's name off the top of my head, but basically they replace him with Hindenburg, and Hindenburg brings his lieutenant with him, Ludendorff, right? And they're able to say, okay, what can we do? How can we take this into, how can we we reverse this? Hindenburg also is able to get two I think it's divisions or two corps that were going to be sent to the to the fight against the French, which people speculate from time to time that perhaps if they had these extra forces, they could have actually won the race to the sea, right?
Not necessarily.
But I don't. Yeah, I kind of doubt that would have been the case. To be honest, I really don't think that would have made much of a difference. But it does relieve pressure. Now, the reason this happens is because the French, of course, are screaming for their ally to help them, which is the Russians. The Russians are committed to doing whatever they can to do this help, but their attack, while it seems massive and it's impressive, is still done long before they're ready to go. They have no logistical support, and so what ends up happening, of course, is initially they have they have great success, but they run out of supplies, and they've got to try and reinforce with supplies. The other thing is that the people that they're throwing into this are not very well trained. They're just, congratulations, peasant, you're now in the military. Here's your rifle. Go fire. Okay, great. They have rifles. You know what they don't have? Artillery. Okay, they don't have modern artillery, and they don't have food. There's no logistics here. Okay, so they begin to suffer, deprivations because of this. The Germans have watched the previous battles. They had front row seats for the previous battles that Russia has fought with Japan, especially around Port Arthur. And one of the things that they took note of was that the Russians, when it comes to radio, have zero radio discipline. That they talk to each other right out there in the clear. That they don't even try to encrypt anything. So they're confident when they're listening to the conversations between Redcliffe and Samanoff that they're hearing the actual movement of troops. That they know, what the dispositions of these things are. And as a result, they set up this defensive line that you see here to prevent Redcliffe from supporting Samanoff, and they do a mass attack on Samanoff. And they actually defeat him. They actually basically almost get to the point of capturing him. Samanoff is so distraught by what has happened that he goes off into the woods and shoots himself. The Germans are able to basically imprison 80,000 Russian soldiers in a massive surprise defeat.
Well, and what do you think? They just started too early. They weren't ready yet. They needed to wait. But by advancing the attack early, they did get the element of surprise because the Germans were betting on them having to delay attack. So if they would have been able to capture German supplies, they could have been okay.
If the Germans had supplies. But this also, at this point in time too, the Schlieffen plan was also starting to fall apart because the lines are starting to stabilize, and you had some elements of the German army saying, "Oh, we're only 30 miles from from Paris. We can see the Eiffel Tower from here. Send us more reinforcements. We'll push through." And so units are starting to get moved within the whole swing element, so that's starting to become a less cohesive attack. So this whole instance of, had those reinforcements not been sent to the Russian front, had they gone to France, no, I reckon they probably would have been ineffectually used if indeed that happened.
But I agree with you there. I'm not one of those people who believes that it could have, the von Schieffelin plan ever could have worked. But what it does do is it shifts the main focus of the battle for the Germans away from their initial intent, which was knock France right out of the war quickly, and then pivot on the Russians, and then say, okay, we've just got to deal with the Russians. And so it changes. It changes the strategic mindset of the Germans. Meanwhile, in the seas, the Germans are having some initial success with the Gneisenau and the Scharnhorst, I believe, right? Isn't the
Gneisenau is the one you fucked the pronunciation on. The Scharnhorst you got right.
Well, I never said I was very good at pronunciation, But yeah, they are basically pocket battleships that are released to go wreak havoc. All right, in the Atlantic, and they are basically being chased by the British. And we'll I don't know if we really want to talk about those battles and how they ended up at this point, but so the news is not all bad for the Germans, all right, but at the same time, it's not all good. The problem now, though, is the British have also rechanged their idea of where they're going to do the fleets, and they put the fleet in Scapa Flow. They're not doing a close in. What do you call it? A blockade. They're actually using a distant blockade. Okay, and that's where people, don't realize the blockade was happening before you even got close to the British Isles. Whereas before, they would just blockade a port. They would just blockade the coastline, and they'd have ships all along the coastline. Well, that's not going to work. Okay, everyone understands that would be a disaster for the British. That would be a disaster for any nation nowadays, considering how new weapon systems have come into the fore. And of course, the one new weapon system that everyone fears is the submarine. Okay, so you're not going to do close in. What they do is they move to Scapa Flow so that if the high seas fleet, the German fleet, decides to sail, the Grand Fleet can sail against them.
Okay, so let's talk about the U-boats. All right, so were they fully submergible first off, or did they skim the top of the water in World War One?
No, they were fully submersible. All right.
Okay.
But the initial rules of war, which are initially held, mean that when they pop up, they have to pop up and declare, "I'm going to sink you." You have to to the merchant ship and tell the merchant ship you got to abandon ship. And so initially at the start of this is what the Germans are doing. They're obeying the laws of the sea. And so they would pop up, tell the merchantman to heave to, we're going to put a torpedo in your ship, and they would fire torpedoes. Right now, one thing that is still very true is the effectiveness of torpedo fire from the surface is significant. It's far better. It's far more accurate. Okay. Now, however, what are the British response to this? The British response to this are Q ships.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, which is, yeah, I'm a merchantman until I drop all these sides and I have major guns, and then I try to sink your ass. Okay, so the German people would pop up and say, okay, we're gonna, you have to abandon ship. And, okay, we're abandoning ship. Down come the sides, and the guns start firing.
Well, then who violated the rules of war then? The Germans or the British? Because the Germans do end up just staying submerged and firing indiscriminately.
Well, that's a quick way to convince you to say, well, screw it. If they're going to play the Q ship game, we'll just start sinking the subs from under the water, right? And they begin to do that. They begin to fire torpedoes. Now, the thing about a submarine when it's underwater, it's very much slower. Okay. So there's an advantage to staying on the surface, all right, during an attack, okay, because you can get away faster, etc. Even the Q ships, one of the disadvantages of the Q ships is they really are merchantmen, all right. They're not warships. They don't have the speed of a warship, so a submarine can get away from them fairly easily. But of course, if you're too close, a couple rounds in your boat, and you're pretty much going down to the bottom of the ocean. All right, so it's still very, very dangerous. All right, so it's a very effective technique. But what the Germans quickly learn, of course, is that the time that they can make their attacks is at night. That's when they can run on the surface. It's hard to see them coming. All right, and the attacks can be most effective.
Are these U-boats running in packs like World War II?
They don't start that way, no.
Not yet. Not yet, but it's also interesting to see that the similar tactic of running on the surface actually was quite prevalent in World War II. Everybody seems to think, the prowling U-boats, they'll strike from underwater, but no, they were actually getting in amongst, like they were driving up the rear of fucking convoys and stuff, getting in amongst the convoys, launching a couple of torpedoes, and then going underwater and then dropping back a bit while they reload and then come in again.
Right. Well, what they would do is they would fire off those torpedoes. They would then go off. They would submerge. They would go off to the side to where they couldn't be seen. Then they would go to the surface and then do a sprint to try and get ahead of the convoy. All right, which has now been delayed. Right, and then wait. And then at night, they would say, okay, the convoy should be around here at night. And then it would pop up at night and look around. And sometimes they were right, like you said, they were right in the middle of the convoy.
Yeah.
Which means, oh, it's happy time. Fire torpedo over here and a torpedo over there. And ships are sinking.
You get a torpedo and you get a torpedo. You get a torpedo.
You know? And then of course, the U-boat would get a destroyer. But that's, you know... But it was still a very dangerous time. I mean, even for that's once the convoy system came into being. The problem is at the beginning of the war is that just for whatever reason, ships didn't want a convoy. They didn't want to get into a convoy. They wanted to whenever they want. So it was a matter of, you know, the Germans would lay in wait and then look around, and then if they saw a ship that was running around by itself, they would approach it and then sink it. And that's how they began the battle. Now, initially, they were letting certain ships go past without any kind of, you know, challenge or whatever. Right? They would see ships that were obvious passenger ships, like the Queen Mary. Right? They would let those ships go by. If it was a passenger ship, like a Titanic-like type ship, they would say, "Okay, we're not going to sink it. This is the initial phase. It isn't toward in later on that you end up like with the sinking Lusitania and so forth." But at the beginning of the war, in the first month of the war, it's kind of an honorable kind of a war. No one's there's high expectations for the people, but there's not really an understanding. And you also got to remember, at this point in time, yeah, you have radios, yeah, you have instantaneous communication. But there's still a lot of confusion as to what's really going on. The import of just how, you know, these big casualty lists as they start to mount, right? It really hasn't fully come into knowledge. It hasn't been, you know, the knowledge of just how devastating, how horrible these battles are that are beginning. It really hasn't dawned on people yet. Right.
Yeah, this is also sort of a drawback to the old attitudes and all that kind of stuff as well about, you know, war being gentlemanly or sport-like and things like that. You know, it's an honourable thing, and those attitudes and whatnot. Well, on the ground, that quickly went by the wayside because, well, they didn't really have time to, you know, shake hands and toss the fucking coin before they figured out who was batting and who was bowling. But you have things like in the Navy, for example, and this even still translates into World War II, where with merchant raiders and stuff like that, and sometimes would pick up the crews and drop them to a safe port. They wouldn't just indiscriminately fucking shoot things because it's not very gentlemanlike to just go up and fucking sink some cunt. And that attitude was quite prevalent up until the point where the one side just goes, yep, you know what, we've had enough of this. We're just going to shoot the bastard straight off. You know, fuck this handshake bullshit. And then it was on for young and old. And that also, that attitude, because, you know, the Air Forces were in new service and they were also writing the rule book as they went with that one, that was also seen as a gentlemanly sport and things like that.
Yeah. And in fact, in the early parts of the battle in the first few months, you end up with, when the submarines are sinking some of these ships, they're actually sticking around to pick up survivors.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, I know that is
transporting them to, many of them were transported by German submarine to Ireland.
Yep.
Ireland had declared its neutrality and they were being dropped off. Now, that didn't last very long because the British were like, okay, you dropped him off in Ireland. We know there's a sub there. We'll wait for the bastard to come out and sink his ass. Right? And they quickly stopped doing that. But initially, this is what they were doing.
Well, no, and my question would be to expand on this, and maybe this will end up being a shortened episode since we started late. We'll see. But in the first month of the war, did you see many clashes in the Africa region or the Middle East theaters?
Not as of yet, no.
No. You have skirmishes in the colonies, but they're nothing that's going to actually change a colony. They're basically like, okay, the war's begun. What do we do? The forces in the colonies are basically wondering, okay, what do I do? Do I get ordered back to Germany? Do I get ordered back to England, back to France? Am I fighting there, or am I supposed to fight within the colonies? How am I going to do this? So the initial month of the war, they're basically paralyzed in that. Okay, what do we do? Now there are some skirmishes, but they're very minor. They have no real effect.
There's one part of South Africa, I can't remember exactly where it was, but there's this giant lake in it pretty much, and the Germans controlled one end of it and the Brits controlled the other. And the Germans had an actual warship. And you'd think, oh, well, that's a one-sided deal. The fucking Germans are going to know. The thing basically just, the entire war just sort of just drifted around the lake. It was going to do something, that then it went back to port and then come back out and just meandered all over this fucking lake and never fired a shot. Because they didn't know what they were doing, but down that far south.
Yeah, what are you going to do? To what advantage would doing anything?
Yeah. Oh wow, we won this bit of territory, right? Well, now we got twice the territory. Yay, whoopie-doo.
No way to actually defend it against a true counterattack if that happens. So why would I actually take this territory if I can't hold it?
Yeah, that's right.
What does the nation gain? So the colonies are basically, I'm going to be real blunt, they're basically left on their own. Wait it out, see who wins, and whoever wins becomes the property of the other. That's generally what's going on. And with the exception, of course, of the Japanese, who declare war and go, okay, we're going to take out these small islands, and we're going to snatch them up from the Germans. And
that's amputations. So, like they're an island nation. What else would they want? Is a bunch of islands, or
you got to remember who the Japanese have recently thought of as their biggest bad enemy.
That's the Russians.
The Chinese. Oh, I thought it was the Chinese. They've been clashing with Chinese for years.
They're taking Chinese territory, but they're doing it in combat against the Russians, really, not really the Chinese. I mean, the Chinese are basically a defeated group of warlords, and yeah, you have to deal with the warlords now and then, but overall, they don't have any kind of real standing power to stand up to us if we desire. It's the Russians you have to worry about.
As a military, the Chinese were pretty much non-existent at the time.
Well, because they weren't a cohesive force. It was.
That's right.
The China is basically in the midst of a massive civil war. And when I talk about massive civil war, we call it a civil war for lack of a better term. In reality, you have multiple different warlords, all vying to become the next emperor. All right, so it isn't just one guy rebelling against the central authority. It's multiple groups fighting amongst themselves to see which one's going to come out on top.
And by this stage, it's been going on for about 14 years. It's mainly kicked off with the Boxer Rebellion in about 1900.
Well, the Boxer Rebellion ends any kind of pretense that the imperial power of any kind of imperial power. It's really the end of the imperial power. That's what the Boxer Rebellion was, the last gasp of imperial authority. But you're right. It does basically end it does mean that what you have are warlords in areas, and then the power of the warlords in those areas become the predominant force.
Well, no, and as you're looking at the first month of the war, Australia is just now mobilizing, right? She isn't really in battle anywhere yet.
Not at the moment, no.
No, and of course the same thing applies to Canada. You got to remember, there was a great patriotic fervor, in these areas to go save the motherland.
However, having said that, The instant that basically we got involved in the war, we did fire the first Allied shots, meaning the Commonwealth shots, and we did this basically twice in both wars. A German merchant ship was coming into one port in Melbourne, and we told them to stop, and they didn't stop because they didn't know the war had kicked off. So we fired a few shots at them, and the same thing happened on the eve of World War II.
So in other words, they become the proud captors that kick the war off.
Yep, we fucking started it. We fired the first Allied shots. Blame us.
They're the South Carolina of the Commonwealth.
Actually, war is declared before they did that.
Oh, bugger off him.
Hey, we're not South Carolina. We don't fuck our cousins. That's just the Tasmanians.
The Battle of Tannenberg, though, has ramifications continuously, because it's from this point on that the Russians, all right, start dealing with the fact that they're horribly unprepared for war. And the other thing about it is when they captured the soldiers, they basically captured half of the available artillery, heavy artillery that the Russians had. The myth of the invincibility of the Russian, juggernaut, where they could put 2.5 million men into the field at any point in time, which is true, but you couldn't feed them, you couldn't clothe them, you couldn't give them any kind of really heavy guns because the industry just wasn't ready for it. The Russians would have been much better off. They really would have been much better off if they had ignored going to battle straight against the Germans and then just hammered the holy crap out of the Austrians.
It's also flat out organisation. I mean, you can't put 2.5 million troops in one area. You've still got to actually fucking organise them into a cohesive fighting force. And if you can't, you're just going to have shit tons of blokes just standing around getting captured.
And that's accurate as well. What worse than that is the emperor, right, Tsar Nicholas. He wasn't a military commander. Okay, he wasn't a horrible leader, but he wasn't a military commander at all. And so his deference to the people that had been selected as military commanders, you would say, okay, well, I got to give it to the other military commanders. But you got to remember, this is truly still an aristocratic mentality. So he's handing it to dukes and other aristocrats. He's trusting other aristocrats to be the military commanders, and they're no more of a military commander really than he is. They're not a professional military force going against the ultimate professional military force, the Prussians, directly into the teeth of the Prussians. Total mistake.
Well, interestingly too, this is something that's also reflected on the English side as well, is that a lot of their hierarchy in the military only got that way because they were a lord or something along those lines. Sandhurst was a thing, and there were professional military officers and all this kind of stuff, but they were usually sort of fucking, what was the cunt's name? But he I can't remember now. No, the British cunt. Fucking
John French.
No, the other bloke.
I don't know who you're talking about.
The cunt from the poster.
Yeah, that's Sir John French, isn't it? The cunt from...
No.
Oh, no. I know who you're talking about now. Was it Kitchener?
That's the fucker. Yeah, just to give you an idea of how the Australians were working. Yeah, we had a professional army. Yes, we had professional officers up until a point when we got deployed with the British. We had fucking Kitchener telling everybody, below him how to fucking run the war. And we've always been saying that we'd rather our blokes fucking lead our guys because at least they know what they're doing. And so you did have these officers that were being vetoed by fucking cunts who had just basically got their commission because they were a lord. Well,
Kitchener came to fame fighting against the Muslims in Khartoum and in the Sudan area, right? And so that's all well and good when you're fighting against, an inferiorly equipped force, right? That isn't professional. You're fighting against, for lack of a better term, barbarians. All right, from their standpoint, I'm not saying that they were barbaric. In some ways, they were, but I mean, that's not what I'm saying. You're a disorganized force in comparison to a professional military. The British, though, they had Sandhurst. They had professional military. Russians had none of that.
Yeah,
they at least had some. The Russians had nothing like that. So their call to arms, they immediately mobilized. They brought in a lot of troops, but they weren't prepared to fight. And the Germans, though, at the beginning, you got to remember, the Germans at the beginning of this campaign are willing to sit back. They're waiting for the hammer blow of the Russians. If the hammer blow of the Russians, though, would have stayed on the Austrians, which were basically, they had German troops to an extent, and they had some influence from the Germans, but in reality, they had organized very similarly to the Russians. It was still, like you were saying, an aristocracy, and these were the people doing the leadership. So they were being poorly led as well, even though they had better equipment. So you had poor equipment or better equipment, but poorly led soldiers against poorly led soldiers. Okay, well, then it's just a matter of who can bring more to bear, really, is what it would have turned into. Instead, however, by launching that attack directly against the Germans, it did relieve some pressure from the French overall, but in reality, all it did was cause the Germans to shift their focus to begin to focus against the Russians, when as before they would have just been sitting back, waiting, all right, and not going on the attack, not being aggressive in that kind of an attack, and just sitting there. So, and I honestly think that the Russians, with all that military force, would have been much better served going against the Austrians. They would have had far more success. Okay, in fact, their battles with the Austrians are successful initially until the Germans start funneling troops to support them. All right, initially they're able to beat the Austrians back. It could have changed the entire dynamic then. Now, how effective would it have been? Well, if they were being successful like that, it's very possible that the Turks go, okay, we're just going to keep our agreement quiet and not actually try and enter the war.
Well, that'd be right. Yeah, like, well, if they did have a massively concerted effort against Austria, Austria didn't really have the fundage for a major large scale war, and if they were basically kicked the fuck right at the beginning, it probably would have destabilized the alliance with the Germans and the Austrians.
Well, yeah, I mean, it may have actually they may have been actually successful in opening a corridor to where they could actually successfully relieve the Serbs, right? To at least be able to funnel in men and food and supplies directly into the Serbians. Now, what would that have been successful overall? Who knows? But it definitely, you're having success in one area, you're not having success in another area, plus the fact that initially the Germans aren't attacking you. Well, okay, then why don't you put troops in there to defend? Everybody knows at this point in time that being in the defense is good. Okay, I mean, they're all aware of this, that you need fewer troops in the defense. Well, if you put an equal number of troops in the defense for the Russians, all right, on the border with Germany, the Germans wouldn't have attacked because they never would have had enough troops to actually do it. It's when they realize just how poor quality is being thrown against them that the Germans realize this is our opportunity to take on the Russian bear. And it would have. Go ahead.
I was going to say absolutely, and Russia immediately starts having issues, which eventually the Tsar will take over the running of the military, which doesn't end well either.
Well, the Tsar has actually been trying to modernize his country. All right, he has created the Duma. All right, he's created basically the Russian Parliament. He's creating these things. right? Because he realizes Russia has to modernize, and he realizes also that in order to modernize, you've got to have some of the modern structure set. So he looks at the two, military power states, the Germans and the English, and they're like, okay, well, they have monarchies too, but they have they have a parliament, they have like the Reichstag, they have parliament. So it's like, okay, well, I need to create something like that in a similar type of frame so that I can bring all my people out of the serf mentality and into the rest of the wider world. The problem with him doing that is, of course, he's doing it at the expense of his nobles. The nobles are furious with the creation of the Duma. They are absolutely. So you have, you want to talk about palace intrigue, all right? I mean, there are plenty of people in the aristocracy that want to kill Tsar Nicholas and replace him. So he's trying to walk. He's in a dangerous game. Yes, it's just like every other nation. When the war first begins, there's this great patriotic fervor. The Russians are flocking to the Tsar. They're going to be part of the Tsar's army. Plus the fact it gets me out of way of being a serf. I'm no longer a serf if I'm a soldier.
Well, no, and the thing is, who would they pass it down to? The son is, useless. He has a severe disease. He's frail. You can't put him on the crown.
He's also very young.
Yeah.
And so what you end up with, typically what happens in European things, so those situations are somebody kills off the king. The king is then the person who then takes over says, I'm the regent of the young son, and the young son at some point disappears from history. Kind of like Tower of London thing.
Yeah, exactly, which would have been easy in this case because, after Rasputin, we all will talk about what happens to him. But after
we're going to have to do a whole episode, I think, focused on the Russian royal family and Rasputin and how all that plays out.
But, and it's really interesting. It really is. So, we might want to do that sometime soon because halfway through the war is when the murders occur. So,
well, I think that we have to talk about the stabilization on the Austrians and what starts happening when Austria-Hungary, Italy joins the war. We got to talk about that next. All right, so that all the major players are involved. All right, and also what the strategic plan begins to be for the High Seas Fleet.
And then there's an American election rolled up into the next little bit. So
now, this is 1914. You got to remember, I just want everybody to realize this is 1914. Okay, it's still 2 years from the American election. So
true.
This is the beginning in 1914. It's not the beginning of 1914, but the war begins in 1914 and basically in August. So the end of 1914. So as 1915 goes on, and then as 1916 goes on, the terrible, horrible attrition losses on the Western Front begin, and the destruction of the Russians begin. All right, and the horrible losses. And now, I think that next week, to be honest, if you want, we can talk about the initial naval phases and then go into the battles of the Marne. I think the Battle of the Marne is 1915, isn't it? Fardy, is that correct?
I think so.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good idea. And sorry about that yelling. They're playing behind me. Sorry. But I do have Game of Thrones here in about an hour, which means we have to set up for it. So I think this week will be a short episode. Next week will be the regular time. I do apologize. We've been geeking out on Vampire the Masquerade, to be honest. So my bad, guys. We'll be back on the regular schedule next week. And we will be back later tonight with Game of Thrones. Will everybody riot? We'll see. And
get your marshmallows ready.
Yeah. And here's the cabbie. I think we're going to dedicate the World War I series to him because he wanted to be a part of it. He was excited for it, and well, he left us too soon. So I think this whole series will be dedicated to cabbie. Once again, here's my good buddy. I'm going to take a drink and then sign us off. That one's for you, buddy. Good night, good luck. Don't go to France. You know you don't want to go to France. And if you do, cabbie might haunt you. It might happen. You never know. Everybody go check out MC's morning news shorts that he does. Well, by short, I mean an hour of an old man yelling at the sky. But hey, that's not long enough, right? Everybody needs more MC. Farty, you're going to be around again next week, right?
Yep.
You said yes.
All right, everybody. Good night, and we'll see you in a few hours. Oh, God. I don't know if I'm looking forward to this or not.